film at, oh, sorry, yes, we're recording in progress. So I'll start again. I'm PhilipShane, and I've been editing for about, editing documentaries for about 30 plus years. I started out in, well, first of all, I started out making my own projects when I was in school. And actually, I got started when I was just thinking about film in general. I got a degree in film, and I started out in science, switched to film because the math was too hard in engineering and physics. And turned out there was a lot of math in film too, but that was a whole nother thing. Anyway, my mother volunteered at a mental health facility, at a halfway house for people with things like schizophrenia and other related illnesses who were able to function in the community, but also kind of needed assisted living or something like that. And without my knowledge, one day, I guess there was a meeting at this mental health facility, and they said, you know, we need to make a video that we can use for fundraising. And I guess I had just graduated from the University of Maryland with a degree in radio, television, and film. And so my mother said, oh, my son can do that, and came home and told me that. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know how to do that. I figured it out, and I made a 10-minute documentary. I went there and I filmed on VHS, which was a whole exciting experience, and but interviewed people and then edited it together, and then had a friend from the record store I worked at who was also a composer, gave me some music, and I put it together, and then they showed it and they raised money off of it. And I found that incredibly meaningful. Documentary was not something I had originally thought about doing. And since then, I've continued to work in documentary, obviously, and in particular with a focus on biographies, or so personal stories, perhaps not so much. There were a couple projects of my own. I started making my own personal documentaries, and my hat goes off to all of you who are doing that, because I found it so frightening. And I started hearing so many bad things, each person bad mouthing the other person in the family. I was like, I don't know if I can make this movie. Nonetheless, I started out at Maysles Films, one of the great documentary houses. Unfortunately, David Maysles had passed away just prior to my going there, but I worked with Albert and Susan Fromke and Deborah Dixon and Henry Cora and and Bob Eisenhardt, a great editor, and Larry Silk, also a great editor. And I got this unusual training. The way I became an editor was because we were still editing on film then. We were editing on Steenbecks, flatbeds. And the computer editing systems were just coming out at that time. And because I had some experience with computers, they asked me and another friend of mine who was working in the office to go try out all the different editing systems and pick which one seemed to be the best. And so I tried all of them, which was interesting. And Avid seemed to be the best. And they bought an Avid based on my recommendation. And suddenly I was the only person in the office who knew how to turn the thing on, let alone use it. I spent 2 weeks just every night. I went in there and just worked my way through the tutorials and all this stuff and learned it real fast, and then ended up teaching all the editors. So when I would go to Christmas parties and I'd see all these other editors who are of the generation above me, the ones who definitely taught me how to edit, but I would point to all of them and say, you'd all be out of a job if I didn't teach you how to edit. I got this incredible experience, though, for about 2 or 3 years, where I had to sit between the master editor, let's say, and the machine. So I was their hands. So, you know, they'd say, well, do this, cut here, do that, move there. And I would show them how to do it using the computer, and they would show me how to do the art of editing. So it was extraordinary. Long story short, after there, I went to I started working in a number of different places, the Learning Channel, doing documentaries for New York Times Television. And also I started working at ABC News with Peter Jennings and some others, Barbara Walters eventually, and other people there, doing long form documentaries, which was also incredibly rewarding. Essentially, we were doing what we like to call PBS style films within the network system, which was a really rewarding thing to get to do, some specials. And since then, I've also worked on a lot of independent feature film documentaries, mostly mostly biographies, because that's what I love the most, and very often about people in the arts. I've worked with a lot of great musicians, and also science. I did a documentary about Einstein. So anyway, I've done a lot of different things there. So, and I'm happy to talk about anything you guys want to know. So I don't know if Peter, I talked to Peter earlier and said, if people want to throw out questions ahead of time, maybe if we have a list of questions, I can work my way through that. Whatever's most of most interest to you. And anybody who can come on camera would be great, because I'm looking at a bunch of boring fonts. Say hello. Hi, Jushen.
Hi. Hi, Philip. I wasn't able to
Hi, Bindi.
visit you during New York
Hi, Lynette.
stay. Yeah, but it was good to see you. Yeah.
Likewise. Thank you, Jushen.
So Philip was asking, kind of, what do we want to hear about? What's most important to each of us? Sherry and Doug both talked about naming conventions or naming process as something with PTSD.
I had a question for Philip.
Good, Mark.
So Philip, I can't believe that you guys went from cutting on the Steinbeck right to Avid. So that must have been what, 1994?
93.
93. Amazing
yeah.
that you guys never even touched analog video, and then you went right to
no. Well, I had also done when I was going to school, everything was on tape.
You were doing
we
three-quarter, probably three-quarter to three-quarter, right?
Yeah, three-quarter. Also half inch, but yeah.
What a
Maisels was all film. I will say that they were all.
What
film.
a great experience for you to have,
yes.
to do that. Unreal.
I'm glad I got at least a little bit of it. I had about, all through film school, everything we did was on film too. So I had about 6 years. I went to NYU grad school in film and cinema studies as well. So I had about 6 years on
nice.
Film before. Yeah.
I always tell people about the beginning of Avid, and my first experience with it was probably about 94. And the 9 gig hard drive cost $3,500.
Oh, I remember the 1 gig hard drive, 1 gigabyte costing $1,000. And so that means that a 1 terabyte, like this phone has a terabyte in it. A 1 terabyte drive would cost $1 million today.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And it bubbled.
And it was the size of, it was huge thing.
So Philip, one thing that I'd love you to walk us through, you're such a pro, and many of us are in different stages of our film, of our career, but love to, how do you work with someone who may not be a master at preparing their content and bringing that to a professional editor like you?
So who's the you in that?
You're the professional editor, and
I'm the editor, right? Oh, how is it for me to work with someone who's new to filmmaking?
Yeah, what do you want? What makes the job easiest and most productive for you in our preparation?
Yeah. I'll be honest. It's funny because there are certainly things that we would prefer as an editor, like, oh, it'd been nice if you had worked this out ahead of time or stuff like that. But partly I would say it's actually the job of the editor to help the filmmaker through the process. So wherever you're at. I would actually say, don't delay contacting editors. Don't put it off thinking you have to do something or get to some point, because eventually you may put it off a long time. I'd say, if anything, one of the things that the editors would prefer the most is actually to be in touch with the project as early as possible. Now, that doesn't mean, for instance, let's say before you're shooting, okay, or you're in pre-production or something like that, you could be in touch with an editor. Most editors are not going to be able to commit to you to say, yeah, I'll be available, because we have no idea when. You don't even have any idea when you'll actually start editing. But at some point, where you really are feeling like you're getting close to bringing an editor along, well, I'd say this. It would help you to actually bring on an editor, or editors also have, a lot of editors happen to also be story consultants. And I know we have some of the best here in the business here. Partly that's because of editing is storytelling. In documentary, well, in fiction film, there's this feeling that in documentary, the documentaries aren't written because, oh, how could you know what's going to happen? So you can't write it ahead of time. Because in fiction film, the model is they spend a long time writing a screenplay. Now, the truth is they spend years writing screenplays, very often, the good ones anyway. And then they film it based on that screenplay. They may stick fairly close to it or not. And then in the editing room, they will still change it. But nonetheless, the bulk of the writing process generally is done ahead of time. And documentaries, it's the same thing, except we do it a little bit backwards. The editing phase tends to be the writing process as well. So that's why, for instance, it can take a year or longer to edit your film. That being said, if you can have an idea of what your film is about, and you can have some idea of a narrative structure or structure for the film, whatever that is, in your mind as you're filming, even when you're beginning filming, it's enormously helpful and will help guide you a lot. Because a lot of times you'll end up just shooting vast amounts of material that, because you're still surfing for the idea of what the film might be, or as if you had some focus, you know, I'm really telling the story of this. It'll help you narrow your focus a little bit. And an editor can help you with that, an editor or story consultant, or an editor operating as story consultant, not as editor. That being said, when you come to the editor, I would say it would be nice to know how much footage you have. That's usually my first question, and I'm often shocked at how people don't have any idea. Both in terms of size of the media, I have this many terabytes, and also this many hours of that. Now, a lot of times you don't have that number because you don't know how to get that number, and you may need an editor's help in stringing you may not have put your footage into an editing program of any kind yet, which is what you need. So the editing program is what's going to tell you how to do it. So that's okay. You could just say the editor, but if you can get that answer early on, that helps. So I'll just say this because I often use that as a way to gauge how long it will take us to edit the film. I have a very rough calculation of, and this is really rough and really broad, but I like to say, I finally figured out it takes about 3 to 5 times the length of the footage to edit the film. Well, actually, I'm sorry, to get me to let's say a first rough cut. So in other words, if I have 100 hours of footage, if I say, well, it's going to take me 300 hours to get to my first rough cut, then I would divide 300 by, how many hours are you going to put it in a day? I would actually divide it by 6, because typically you have like 6 good hours in a day. So divide that by that and then tell you how many days you have. And often it's very surprising. It's like, whoa, that's going to take a long time. But that's how long it takes to screen the footage and pull selects and then organize that footage and then assemble it all together and then cut a rough cut. And then at that point, you've got your rough cut. It may take another 6 months past that point from rough cut to final cut. But yeah, that's part of it.
Do you expect or do you want people to cull their rough footage or just give you the whole kit and caboodle?
Actually, I think I'd like to, I want to just reframe everything and say that the editor doesn't want anything. Our job is to come on board and help you make the film. So wherever you're at, you're at. If I was when I'm in a more industrial environment, like when I'm working at ABC News, it obviously helps me if the producer has done the things that is typically expected for a producer to have done prior to sitting down with the editor. That's great. But in this world of independent filmmaking, I mean, one of the main reasons why all of us are here, including editors, is that, look, we could all be making a lot more money. We could all be making money, let alone a lot more editors, a lot more money in another field. So the reason we're here is because there's something about the independent filmmaking process that we like. And the only thing the editor wants is a really good project. and a really, let's say this, maybe here's something else we could talk about perhaps, is a respectful and collegial working environment. You know, that's always nice. But in terms of having stuff together, I wouldn't say there's anything like that. If you can do those things ahead of time, that's great. But the problem is most of the things I would tell you that you should, that'd be nice if you had, are things that you need an editor to do. So given that, in fact, here's a way of working. I think the common way of working is, so you hire an editor. Now, you may or may not have the budget for an assistant editor as well. But if you did, one thing that will often happen is you'll meet with the editor, and you and the editor will get up to speed on what you have, what you don't have, what's organized, you know, whatever. What are the things that need to be done to prep for editing? And a lot of those things could be handed off to the assistant editor, who may then take perhaps even several months doing whatever it needs to be, logging the footage or organizing the footage, getting it into the system. And typically the editor will recommend an assistant that they've worked with in the past. So it's like, I know, you know, them, she's really great. She's going to bring in everything in the system in the way I like. That's something you might do. I can add to that, don't expect to begin editing on day one, whatever day one is. Be prepared for seriously up to several months of the editor comes in and looks at gets their whatever program they're using, Premiere or Avid or et cetera, Final Cut, up to speed, and you start to bring in the footage. There's going to be a lot of surprises. There's going to be a lot of technical questions like, okay, you know, you'd think that this process should be smooth because we've been using computers for 30 years now or whatever, but it never is. It never is. And technology changes, as you know, cameras change, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of time spent dealing with technical stuff that pretty much the editor will deal with, the editor and or perhaps an assistant will deal with. And depending on your technical abilities, you know, you may or may not be involved in that. But know that they're going to have to do a lot of stuff before you even begin screening the footage. Then you'll screen the footage. Typically, you and the editor and the filmmaker together will screen it, although in these days of working remotely, if that's not possible, you'll each just watch it, but you might watch it in tandem. Like this week, we're going to watch this footage and then we're going to talk about this. Or even better, each day, we're both going to watch the footage at home today, and then we'll talk at the end of the day, just so, because it's fresh, you know, and you'll just discuss the footage all the way through and you'll go forward from there.
Philip,
Yes.
thanks for the explanation. That's really helpful.
Sure.
I want to ask you, you know, if we just look at the truly raw footage and all the stuff we've shot, a lot of it will not be that great. So do you think, like, if the director, especially for personal documentary that we live through, that we have some sense for what the story might be, you know, to follow a 3-act structure, for example, that we could, maybe the directors themselves, who, you know, live through the story, know what they want, is to kind of do the work of the assistant editor in a way to kind of whittle it down to, you know, things, the content that are interesting, and that would, you know, remotely even be considered as good raw material for the film itself. And then maybe get it down to, I don't know, 10, 20 hours or something like that, more manageable. And then working with the professional editor like yourself, then it would be more of a kind of a concentrated effort and more productive. What do you think about that?
Absolutely not.
Oh, okay.
So, and it's counterintuitive because everybody says that. Everybody says, oh, you know what? I'm just going to give you the good stuff. As the editor, I would say, no. You don't know what the good stuff is. That's my job, you know? And that doesn't mean that, yes, I may be watching a lot of footage that is just mundane or, is not going to get used. But honestly, some of the most interesting stuff is in the so-called non-useful footage. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, basically anywhere from a little bit more obvious answers are like, there are cutaways in the footage, there are shots of people, there are shots of things that are just super useful. There's a shot of a tree where the sun happened to catch the tree in a particular way. And so you don't know. So I wouldn't do that. You're actually hurting, the less you give to the editor, the less worth you're getting out of the editor. So I would definitely say don't do that. The other thing I would push back on is I would like everyone to strike the word whittle from their vocabulary. I worked with a veteran, I think it was Larry who told me, there was a veteran editor I worked with, Larry Silk, who edited Pumping Iron, that I believe won an Oscar with Arnold Schwarzenegger back when he was a weightlifter. And Larry had also worked with Edward R. Murrow. I mean, he went back up. And I remember him saying to me once, no whittling. There's no whittling. We don't do that. Eventually, I came up with a way of understanding it for myself, which is that I noticed that in French films, and I'm sure you guys have seen this too, the word for editing is montage. And montage, I learned in French, means to build up. And editing in English seems to mean to cut down. And to cut down is a terrible way to make a film. That being said, millions of great films have been made with people doing that. But however, I really prefer to build up the film from the good material. So I'm building it up, growing it organically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think if you think of it that way, it's much more appropriate. So the film does not begin as this epic string out of material. The film begins as nothing, a blank timeline, and then you put something on it and you put something else on it, or you write, stuff like that. So Lynette, if you want to mute, I think I'm catching your, you're having an amazing ferry ride across the, river there. Very cool. So does that help?
Yeah. I see your point.
Unfortunately, it does mean it's a lot more expensive. It's a lot of time. I mean, I could see people's feelings at the only time I would say maybe there's some rationale for not showing some footage to the editor is like the camera got left on. But even that, sometimes there's something in there. In fact, very often there's audio in there. There's all kinds of fun surprises. So.
Yeah. So Philip, I think for a lot of us who are making personal documentaries, the money's coming out of our pocket, at least in the beginning, or maybe we're doing a little $10,000 to $25,000 Kickstarter or Indiegogo, something like that. So you're such an experienced editor of such stature. We'd all love to work with you, but I think the feels like there's a gap in talking with very experienced editors and saying, well, I've only got $10K to start working with, and I don't know where we're going to be able to go. And how would you suggest or recommend that filmmakers try and engage a great editor to work on their project?
Without money?
Without much money. I mean, some, but without, being able to get to, 50 or 100K worth of work.
Well, I think, you put me in a weird position because, I feel like the great editors should be paid what the great editor is worth. So, I think,
absolutely,
yeah, I do think. I'll say this. Look, I've also done Kickstarters. I've been on many Kickstarters and done my own, so I understand that the difficulty in that. And I've made my own films and out of my own pocket, and I understand that. That being said, I think that there's a number of craftspeople who work on films who, so if you have the fortune to work on a fully budgeted film, let's say, and I pretty much that's what I've gotten to work on, right? So something's been made by a production company that's, raised the money, however they've done it, and you're making a film with the full standard independent film budget. Then you work with a composer, and you work with a great editor, or sometimes more than one great editor, and you work with a cinematographer, and so on. And you yourself should be paid. So I think that there may need to be a little bit of a reframing in your own mind as to what is your film actually worth. You know, if you only want to spend, or you only have $10,000 or something like that, then you're going to make it on the resources that you get for that, which means you're not going to have a very experienced editor, probably. You're not going to have a cinematographer. You're not going to have a composer. You're not going to have a sound mix. You're not going to have a publicity budget, you know, on and on and on and on. You may still make an amazing film and breakthrough, you know, absolutely. People have done that. So just know that that's what you're doing. I'd say if you want to, but if you want to, basically, when I raised money for my current film, I was like, having worked on a number of these fully budgeted films, I was like, okay, my film, the documentary about this video game Myst that I'm making, it's like, it's going to have a full budget. And I'm still raising, I still have a lot of money left to raise on it, but I'm like, I know that to me, it makes a difference whether I have the top craftspeople in the business. Let me turn it around, because you're a personal filmmaking group. And I think a lot of that means that often you are making the film yourself, actually, you know, entirely, right? A lot of times personal filmmakers, and I've done this myself too, shot it myself, edited it myself, I would say, let me suggest to all of you that learning the craft of editing is super valuable, even if you don't ultimately become an editor professionally, or even edit your own film. The craft of editing is so integral to it is simply storytelling. And when you know editing, you will be a hell of a lot better filmmaker. I mean, in some ways, it's if there was only one skill you learned, I would actually say learn editing. You can always have someone, you know, point the camera somewhere, not to dismiss the craft of the cinematographer, but I think that's what I would say. I would look towards you editing it yourself if you have extremely limited funds, or getting a young editor. I mean, there's something absolutely to be said for, when I was starting out, I edited many independent films that were extremely low budget and first-time filmmakers. So there's nothing wrong with that. And a lot of that person has often gone to school, although they don't have to have gone to school. Probably, maybe at the very least, get somebody who's cut some things, you know, that you can look at and you can say, hey, that person is really good, and work with them. That person often has a mentor who can come in and look at stuff. And you can often find groups like the D Word or others, or this group, where you can show your work in progress. So I think that's your answer. I'd say ultimately, if you're not cutting it, bring in a young editor and work with them. Yeah. Sherry.
Good, thanks. Who else has a question?
Sherry is waving her.
There's a few hands up, Peter, just FYI. Yeah, so I'm working on my first feature doc. We're in post-production, and I have an editor that I also edit. I know how to edit most of my own stuff, but for this particular project, I knew I needed an editor because it's a personal doc and I'm the main kind of narrative through line. So I didn't want to be, you know, editing myself. So anyway, this short that I did, I hired this editor to see if I liked her, and I did. And so she's editing it. My question, so I have all kinds of questions for you, Philip, and you're always one of the best people who gives feedback in this group, I have to say. So I'm a huge fan of your brain.
Thank you.
So I have big picture questions, but I'm going to go down to the micro because it was mentioned earlier, this thing about naming conventions, because before my editor started working, and I had an assistant editor prep all the interviews and stuff for her, we were gathering a lot of archival materials, and you know, it's about feminist performance art. So we were getting just stuff off YouTube and from artists and all the different crazy naming conventions. And I made a little promo trailer. And then my research assistant got the great idea, which I think it's good, to rename everything, right? To create a naming convention so that we know who owns it, what it is, what, you know, quality it is. Unfortunately, it fucked up, excuse my French, all the early editing I did for promo stuff. And I have spent hours trying to reconnect files. I swear to God, and even though I think I'm close, it never seems to get done. So maybe the lesson is I should have just
And which program are you using?
Premiere.
Premiere. Okay.
Premiere. And my research assistant did create a great database where she said the old name for it was this and the new name for it is this. So you can, clip by clip, but it was this like fast paced, layered thing. And it's, even though it's this tiny little piece, I've never been able to fully reconnect it. What I wish I'd done is, put all that stuff into one folder, not touched it, and said, this is all the stuff for the promo. Now, I don't know I don't know if there's any advice you can give me at this point. I kind of now in retrospect know what I should have done, but I'm still mired in not being able to relink things on the timeline for this particular piece, which I'd like to still have be malleable.
Do you have a backup copy of the media that still is the original names?
No,
Right.
She renamed everything.
So
Yeah.
that really is the first mistake.
Yeah.
We say in the business, they say in the tech business that it doesn't exist until it's in 3 places. 3 places. So, and believe me, your original media is essentially your camera negative, your film negative, what we used to call it. It's the original stuff. That's the most important thing to you, bar none. So as soon as you shoot something, you should immediately, as soon as possible, preferably literally on set or on location, copy it to 2 hard drives, just identically. It takes a little while, but do it. Again, if you're shooting and you have an assistant on the day of the shoot, that helps. Someone who can do media management helps. Then as soon as possible, you should back that up to an online server. I use a service called frame.io, which is now owned by Adobe. It is not great. It's okay. I mean, it's great in terms of it keeps your footage there. The interface is really like something out of 1994 where it's atrocious nonetheless. But it almost doesn't matter. You can use Google Drive as well. Just know that it is going to cost you some money. It's another place where unfortunately you're going to have to spend some money. But because like on frame.io, I probably pay about $250 a month to keep some number of terabytes backed up for me there. And then I have 2 copies. And what I do is the 2 hard drives, generally after you've copied your footage onto them, those 2 hard drives should be in different locations. The idea being if you lost one or if you had a fire or a flood or something like that. So for instance, very often the cinematographer will keep one set of drives and I will keep the other, or a friend of mine, he just keeps all his one set of drives at his mother's house, which his mother's happy about because it means he has to come visit her every once in a while. But yeah, back it up to 3 places. Then you wouldn't have this problem. The second thing is, of course, don't rename your footage. Yeah, that's just not necessary. I never rename the footage, partly just because it's a pain in the butt. You can change the names all you want within the editing program, right? Once you've brought the clips into the editing program, you can change the names all you want. So that's the place to do it. So,
Good. Well, Mark had a question, but he just dropped off. He had to run. So Dan, how about you?
Oh yeah. Well, I was asking a question that Doug sort of answered, but I'd still like to ask it, which is how much should someone try to raise funds for in order to get an editor? I'm not looking to get the best editor in the business, but a good editor to work with. How much do you think a person should set aside for a personal doc?
I think it depends how long you're, so in other words, are they going to work on a weekly rate or a flat rate or something like that? So part of the question is, how long are you going to edit? That's a question.
You said that you would estimate 3 to 5 times as much as the footage you have.
Right.
I've been shooting footage. This will be my 20th year working on this personal documentary. So you can sort of guess that. It hasn't been full time though.
Right, exactly. So really what matters is the amount of actual time that's on the, you know, how much, if you string everything together, what's the duration there? And just let me clarify that 3 to 5 times, that's just to get to a rough cut.
Maybe
then
200 to 300 hours, something
Yeah.
like that.
I don't know, if you had 300 hours, I'm just going to do the math real quick right here. So 300 hours times, I'm going to go 5 because especially if you're inexperienced, you know, I'm going to put you on the long end of the estimate, right? So that's 1,500 hours. And I'm going to divide that by 6 hours of getting through, say 6 hours of footage a day. That's 250 days. If I divide that by 5 days a week, that's 50 weeks. So that's a year to get to a rough cut. So I'm going to guess that your film probably would take 1.5 to 2 years to edit, depending on how long it would go. So the editing rates typically go from, they can certainly be higher and lower than this range, but a brand new editor, I would say, really inexperienced, 2,000 a week, 2,500 for someone who's pretty new. And at the top end, it could go as high as 6,000 or something like that. Some more, some less, you know, but
for a week.
For a week, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Phil, do you, in general, do you work on only one project sequentially, or do you have 2 or 3 projects that you're working on simultaneously and sort of rotating your focus or footage or waiting for funding or composing or?
Well, it depends. If these days I'm often working more in the role of producer director than editor. But when I'm working as an editor, typically you hire me, I'm working for you full time in that time period, you know, and we're going to work on the film. We're going to get it done. Occasionally, I have not really done this. Fortunately, I've just not been in this position, but it's not unheard of for people to say, I raised a certain amount of money. I can pay you to edit, to work for me for a few months or something like that. And then I'm going to be out of money and I'm still raising money. But if you could just work for me for those 3 months, and then hopefully I'll be able to get you back after I've raised the money and we'll continue. That's not unheard of. So that can be done. But generally you're not stopping and waiting for things, because it can all be, a lot of it can be done simultaneously. Yeah.
Drew has a question.
Yeah, so Philip, my question's about when you work with an editor.
Recording in progress. There are more of us these days, a lot more of us these days, who have studied writing, narrative writing, and are applying that to documentaries. Bottom line is, I apply it at every stage. So even when I've simply thought, if I simply conceived of an idea, I say, okay, well, let me work out what would be the narrative structure for this. That being said, after you've shot, let's say you've shot, and if you've done writing, if you've done outlining and structuring or whatever, you can even pre-script. You can do paper cut, or you can write a script, sort of a tentative script. Well, I think, for instance, a lot of times I will have conversations with the people I'm going to interview, right? You have pre-interview questions with them. And I will pretty much know how, like, they've told me this story a couple times, so I can actually write a script using the words that I'm pretty sure this is how they'll tell it. If in the actual interview I'll use that script to do my interviews, right? I'll interview them. They may tell it completely differently. Great. Okay, that's fine. So let's say you've shot everything. The very first thing I would do is screen all the dailies, and then work on the structure of the film. you know, as I'm screening the dailies, I'm pulling selects, but I don't necessarily need to use the selects to write the script, but I might have them, you know, while I'm screening, I might as well mark my selects. It's great, but I will then do that because that tells me how to edit. Here's what it boils down to. The reason I started using writing, what you call it, methods like outlining and writing scripts / paper cuts so much was that at some point during my editing career, I had gotten good enough that I had this sort of nihilistic or existentialist moment of like, I realized, oh my gosh, I could cut this scene in an infinite number of ways. I could make this a happy scene, a sad scene. I could make it about that person or this person or that person or about none of these people. But, you know, I eventually realized, wow, I've got the skills now to cut a good scene that's entertaining and gripping and whatever, and I could do it in an infinite number of ways. So which is the right way? And so I said, you know, when I was at ABC News, there you have a producer that does write a script and hands you a script. Now, hands the editor the script. The editor is free to change it completely, but at least it's a starting point. And it'll be 2 columns, and it'll have video on one side and audio on the other. So video would be sort of suggested B-roll, for instance. And in the audio, this is the sound bites. So this is the voiceover from the interviews that you're going to do. And it's all kind of crafted together. And I thought to myself, when I'm doing my own films too, or I'm editing someone else's films, it'd be nice to have something where the scene it's already been worked out what the point of this scene is. It's really important for this scene to be about this particular thing. It's really important that it contain this piece of information and all of this stuff, because I've worked out the very complex web of, you know, however many, if most scenes are 2 to 3 minutes, you know, let's call it 3 minutes. And if I have a 90-minute film, I have 60 scenes. So I might have 60 to 70-ish scenes, you know. This scene has already been worked out because it's at this point in the story where I'm on my way from the character's transformation from that to this other thing. Anyway, all this kind of stuff. So then I can simply focus on editing the scene and just making it beautiful, and all the hard part about what is the important information to be conveyed in this scene has already been worked out. So I would do that. In other words, I would not, you can edit, there are people who have looked for 1 million years, or at least 100 years, people have edited documentaries by simply watching all the footage, pulling selects, boiling it down, feeling it out, making some index cards, roughing out a structure on a cork board, and then just kind of editing scenes, and in some ways whittling down, as you might say, or moving things around, do it completely intuitively. You can do all that. But I have always felt that even at the end of the process, I was just barely getting to the point of understanding the intricacies of how tightly these scenes can be woven together to evoke something. And I prefer to map that out ahead of time. And then I can use another set of skills while I'm editing, or the more aesthetic.
Thank you. A quick, yeah, that's really good. A quick question about what transcript generating app or software do you use other than the Premiere, which I understand has a, you know, feature now that you can.
Basically, there is no shortage now of, and there have been for a number of years, there have been automated transcript services. They are somewhat better now. However, none of them, unfortunately, are really up to the accuracy you need to edit if you're going to do things like I do, which is I really want to take those. I'm going to do a paper cut, right? Everybody knows, I think, what I mean, paper cut, right? Sort of map out. So I'm going to actual quotes, and I am taking words. You know, I'm doing what you will eventually do in the editing software, but I'm just taking words from this sentence and putting it there, and I'm noting the time code of those words, and I'm taking some words from somewhere else, and I'm putting that at the end of that sentence, and I've got the time code for those so that I know how to edit those together. You can do it for free. I use Descript, but honestly, it makes no difference. I don't think it makes any difference. They're all sort of okay, and none of them are that great. You really, if you can at all invest in the human done transcript. So I use Rev. It's by no means the best. It just happens to be one I use, and they have a nice web interface, rev.com, rev.com. When you upload to them, you can have them do either automated transcripts or for a low price, or for slightly higher price, you can have human done transcripts. Ultimately, the human done transcripts are the only ones that are truly accurate, and that's a really important thing. So,
but at what point would you do that? Like, do you do it
Immediately.
when? No, I mean, at what stage would it be? At the rough cut stage, or do you
no,
get
it's the
tons
daily.
of,
It's the dailies
oh,
you're
the day
transcribing.
you
Yeah.
have all
You're
the
not
stuff.
transcribing the cut.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
The raw
And
material.
you can do fun things. I'm just going to throw out something else, or some point I'd love to talk more, or maybe I'll put a course together of you can take those transcripts and you can put them into AI, put them into ChatGPT, and do all kinds of interesting things, having the AI analyze the transcripts. But nonetheless, I recommend doing human done. Yeah.
Would that be for helping keyword search type of things, or like what the purpose of having it so early on?
The purpose of doing the transcript immediately?
Yeah, so early on, yes.
Oh, just because you might as well. You might as well. You can, if you're going to be writing, if you're going to be working on an outline and all that kind of stuff, and you want to have the transcripts available, then you just need to do it at that point, obviously. So yeah, I mean, I just figure as soon as I've done it, I might as well have it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sounds like that helps a lot in the writing process.
Entirely. Yeah.
Sherry's back with a question.
Yeah, just by the way, I use otter.ai, and I used to use Rev, and the humans are very good, but it's very expensive. It used to be $1 a minute. I don't know what it is now. So I use otter.ai. So it's artificial intelligence does your first draft, and then you listen and you clean it up yourself, because you can understand and you know what people are saying. So anyway, and it's very cheap. It's like less than $100 a year, and you can give it tons of stuff. So it's very cheap. So I would recommend that.
Yeah, that's a budget-friendly option, is if you're willing to
Yeah.
put the time in to fix the edits. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does take time to do that.
It does. It really does. Or you can have research assistants help with that stage of it, which I've also done, like college students. But Philip, my question, I always wish, so my editor has a hard drive, I have a hard drive, and I have a second editor that has a hard drive. So we have the stuff in multiple places, but I often wish there was a central hub so that we're all working with the same data and the same timelines. And I know my editor edited a HBO limited series recently where, all the footage was in a closet somewhere in Burbank, and she was just accessing a desktop that other editors could also access. But I have yet to find like what that is, what program. She doesn't know herself. Like
it's very expensive.
Have you ever worked that way? It's very expensive. Okay.
I've only worked. Yeah, I think it's a fabulous thing, and I've only worked that way at the big networks. It's very expensive to maintain that. It's basically extremely secure and extremely high speed network server. So
darn.
So it's not really doable. However, that being said, frame.io is a good sort of central place for just having your footage. But honestly, you don't need, if the drives really are duplicates of each other, and maintaining them, keeping them duplicates is definitely the job. It keeps an assistant very busy doing that. Shouldn't be a problem. You should. I've been doing that since 2005. So for almost 20 years, I've been doing this, where another person has a duplicate set of media, and because I can just email them the sequence, right, which is an incredibly tiny file, and it should pop up on their computer for the most part.
Yeah, so what we do is we keep a folder of stuff that needs to be added, and then periodically we take the hard drive to the editor and add it.
Yep.
And then we can, okay.
Yes, you're doing it right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Quick question. Just tech wise, Philip, I work on Premiere, and I've tried to work with people who use like Final Cut or Avid. It seems like you really need to find a common technology as opposed to trying to convert, or the little edit files that are easy to transfer. Did you say stay with the same platform?
Yes, stay with the same platform. And by the way, I would say go with Avid. You should go. If you're going for the very best, the very best editors are using Avid. Avid is the actual industry standard. Premiere is way up there. Premiere is super popular, especially with independent filmmakers, because it is less expensive and so forth. And it works, totally works, no problem. But yeah, staying with, if you're in Premiere, stay with Premiere. But I just want to remind people about Avid. And you know,
Is there a
when you go to, is there
conversion tech for Premiere files to Avid, or just
There
don't?
is, but it's
don't even
funky.
do it.
It's incredible that in this day and age, even maybe artificial intelligence will solve this problem too. But it's just like in the old days, we had problems going from Windows to Mac. It's the same kind of thing. It kind of works, you know. But
Okay, Dan's got a question. Anybody else? Go for it, Dan.
Yeah, you said not to rename footage, but I am in the process of transferring over old stuff that I originally shot on Final Cut because I'm working in Premiere on a different system, transferring it over from a G5, and the footage that I use in Final Cut, I keep the names, but the endings are not recognizable in Premiere. I think they didn't use .mov on some of the stuff that was shot, and so I'm finding myself having to go back and adding the MOV, and there's no way except for like individually doing that and then replaying it to make sure it plays on the old system, and then then it'll work if I bring it in as a file, that edited file, into Premiere through I forget what that program was, but anyway, it's pretty complicated, and that's really what I need help with right now. I'm doing it myself. I've been editing myself for all these years, and it's
so you're saying you have to add .mov to the files to get them to go into Premiere.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what it was.
But then once you've done that, Final Cut won't load it again?
Then I have to make sure they're playing in Final Cut on the old computer, just so I don't lose it, so I don't lose that structure. And so far it takes a TLC on both ends of it.
Yeah, I don't know. All I'll say is when you're going from one thing to another, that's just part of the price we pay. It's kind of sucks. There are ways to change files en masse, like with one click, change 1 billion files to .mov.
Right. I haven't been able to do that on this G5. I'm not able to do that yet. Maybe a good editor would be able to do that.
Look, because
all I'll say is make sure you just do not do any of this on your original copies. So Dan, have you copied all your footage? Are you working on a duplicate set of media?
Yes.
Yeah. Just make sure you're doing that, because then you can always go back to the old.
Dan, take a look at Bridge, Adobe Bridge.
Yeah, I've been,
Okay,
that too.
That does a lot of the mass naming functions that Philip was referring to. Sherry's got another question. We're coming down to the witching hour here, so maybe this is our last question, unless somebody else does something. Philip's been so generous with his time, I don't want to wear out our welcome. But Sherry's got one more question.
Yeah, no, Philip, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about constructing the story, the story arc. And I just want to be sure you said this, which I'm really excited. You said most scenes are 2 to 3 minutes. You want to think of what's the point of each scene, and the film will have about 30 scenes. That's super helpful. Just that little,
not 30.
Is that 30?
60.
Oh, how many did you?
No, I'm just adding up. So if you have 3-minute scenes, then it depends how long you want your movie to be. If you want a 90-minute movie, that would simply be 3 times 60, which is 90, right?
Yeah. Or so could be more. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But any other advice, we're all doing personal documentaries. So, I'm telling a complicated story that has many voices, but then I'm hanging it on the structure of my trajectory as a character. And so just you know, it's just a bit of a struggle figuring out how to do all that. It's a lot more complicated than just telling a single story, because it's my story and 50 other people's story.
Yeah. So the question is how to,
You know, I don't know, just like advice about how to sort of move through the process of building 3-act structure. I don't know, just any kind of advice about kind of staying on track and
well,
you know,
I'll recommend,
what to
yeah,
say, what to discard. Yeah.
I'll recommend a few things because there's a lot. Obviously, I teach like a year-long course in this, and I, you know, I've spent years doing it. So there's a lot to learn. I can recommend 2 books. I always recommend. One is Robert McKee, Story. It's a book on screenwriting, and another book by Christopher Vogler, Vogler, called The Writer's Journey. In that book, Vogler adapts. Vogler is the guy who adapted The Hero's Journey for film, and it's a wonderful book. And Vogler's book is very easy read. Story is McKee's Story is kind of like the Joy of Cooking book. It's like a huge encyclopedia of like a zillion things you can do to make your story well written. Incredibly helpful. It's got a lot of tips in it, stuff like that. Then I'm just going to give you one little tip, which is how I begin. If you begin at the beginning and then you just start imagining your story forward, you can totally do that. You can explore your story many different ways that way. However, note that when you begin at the beginning, you can go off in an infinite number of directions and you can wind up in an infinite number of places, all of which is fine if you're totally just exploring and trying to just feel out what could your story be. But ultimately, you got to decide one of those things. What I like to do is, again, this is a much longer conversation, but I like to begin at I imagine the ending. Like I imagine, what do I want? I literally will imagine the last frame on the screen that the viewers see before they get up. And I will think about what that is and what does that image mean, you know, and what is that saying about the character, where they are at the end of the story, and how do I want the viewer to feel at that moment? And I say, okay, let's say that. So at the end, my character is happy, rich, satisfied, in a relationship, you know, beloved by millions because of their art. I'm just making a cheesy ending. And then I go to the beginning and I say, well, for my beginning, however I begin, I am just going to put the exact opposite thing. So if also they were old at the end, I'm going to say at the beginning, they're very young, they're completely unknown, they're very poor, they're not loved by anybody, they've never created anything in their life. I mean, you know, I just make the exact opposite thing. Now, what I've done for myself is that there's always that question of like, what's the arc of my film? You know, immediately I've created the maximum arc I could possibly have. And at that point, then I'm going to say, okay, well, I don't know, at the beginning, he isn't all of these things. She isn't all of these things. So, but you know, it begins to help me tell my story. And lastly, in the middle of the film, somewhere in the middle, I want to have the very highest high point and the very lowest low point. So the beginning and the end aren't the highest and lowest points. In fact, the beginning of the story is often where the character is kind of in the middle of their journey or a little bit below. They don't even know they're going on a journey, perhaps. And at the end, they're at some good place, but they're not at the highest or the lowest. They're at some place where their life is going to continue. And it's that real life thing of like, kind of in both, some good, some bad, you know? But in the middle, somewhere in the middle is going to be their moment of their highest high, moment they just felt everything was working, you know? And I'll go even beyond, just absolutely the peak moment of just pure ecstasy. It might have been when something happened to them in their life that really just put them on top of the world, you know, and they thought, wow, from here, I'm going to go on, I'm going to be the best. And then you're also going to have somewhere around the middle of the film, the very, 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 very lowest that they ever were. If you hit those 4 points, you're kind of on your way to having a good story. And I think you've already pushed the bounds of, you've said to yourself, okay, given my material, I need to get to these extremes. So it's not a bad place to start. Yeah, sure.
What a perfect way to end. If
Oh,
we
good.
we could just at the beginning we said, hey, at the end we want to know more about scope and process and
Yeah.
technology and everything else, and we'd all be happy. And what was it, rich and
Yeah, rich,
romance and-
beloved.
so we're well on our way now, Philip, because of your hour sharing your wisdom with us. So
Yeah. Yeah.
thank
yeah.
you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. So I have recorded this, and I'll put it up on the YouTube channel. I'll put the information into the Facebook page. Also put the 2 books. I have some other stuff from some of the Sundance collab courses I've taken on story and editing.
Oh, cool.
That they have lots of resources. So that's part of what we do is share resources. And you've been a
Great.
wonderful resource. Thank you so much, Philip. Really appreciate
Yeah, and I would
it.
just say anyone you can visit, you can contact me through my website. It's usually the easiest. You just go to Philip with 1 L, Shane, SHANE.com. You can hit contact there, and then that'll reach me. And happy to help.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Thank
Thank
you
you
It
so
was
so
much.
wonderful,
much.
Philip.
It was
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you,
very
Philip.
insightful
Thanks,
and valuable.
everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Take care. Be well.
Okay.
Muchas gracias.
De nada.
Exactly. Okay. Arigato gozaimashita. Shesheni. That's for Jushan.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, Jimmy showed up. Well, anyway, thank you, everyone. We'll see you on Friday.
See you.
Thanks, Ju.